an attorney with the Atlanta Legal Aid Senior Citizens Law Project. So I'm in the unit that represents people who are 60 or older in sort of the 5 inner counties. And Atlanta Legal Aid is basically a nonprofit law firm, so we're not charging people for our services. One of the things that my unit has been working on for years has been trying to make sure that people save their homes. And so this sort of property tax stuff falls into that because we want to try and make sure that it's affordable so that people don't lose their homes. And as Mary mentioned, we're trying a new format where we're going to do a little intro video, and then we'll go into my presentation. In my presentation, some pieces of it will overlap the video, so I'll probably sort of jump through those. But where our hope is that it'll give us more time to be able to answer questions.
You know, the Atlanta Beltline connects 45 neighborhoods in our city with 22 miles of trails. But did you know the Atlanta Beltline Partnership connects neighbors like you to resources for property tax relief? It's our mission to empower longtime residents of South and West Side neighborhoods with ways to remain in their homes. We're here to help you follow the steps to successful property tax relief. Homestead Exemption. The name is old-fashioned, but it could give you a significant discount on your property taxes. There's a standard amount your property taxes will be reduced just for filing a homestead exemption, no matter your age or income. This is called the basic exemption, and in some cases, it can limit the total taxable value of your property. You can also qualify for additional county, city, and school discounts if you are a disabled adult, over the age of 62, 65, or 70, a disabled veteran, or the surviving spouse of a veteran, firefighter, or a peace officer. You only need to file once for most exemptions, but Fulton County has one income-based exemption for seniors that must be renewed every 2 years. File on fultonassessor.org by April 1st for the exemption to apply to the current year. If your exemption is denied, watch our video about homestead exemption tax appeals to understand the process for making a case for your exemption. Additional resources and videos are available in the affordable housing section on beltline.org. We're here to help you maximize the benefits available to you. Remember, the most up-to-date information about property tax assessments and appeals is available on the tax assessor's website. But if you're our neighbor on the Beltline, we're here to help you stay in the neighborhood. Find out more about how our empowerment programs and resources can help you do that at beltline.org. Special thanks to Atlanta Legal Aid Society for review and guidance. Copywriting by M. Dashery. Animation by Kwame Nation.
So I'm going to step back a minute, before we start talking about really homestead exemptions and that sort of thing. I'm going to step back and sort of talk about the tax bill itself, because I think most people really, when they think about the property taxes, what they think about is that tax bill. And, most people really only look at that bottom line, how much they have to pay. But in order to think about the ways that you have some control over what that tax bill ends up being, you need to understand that it's actually just the tip of the iceberg. It's actually made up of the value that the tax assessor set, the millage rate, which is basically a fancy word for tax rate, which is set by the county, the city, and the schools, and then the homestead exemption, which is the main focus of what we're going to talk about today. And to understand how those play into a tax bill, you have to understand how your property taxes are calculated. So they start with the total value, and the tax assessors are going to come up with a value that they think your home is worth. It may be accurate, but it may not. They're not coming to your house and actually doing a full appraisal like a true appraiser would do. They may come by, but they're probably just going to drive by. They're not going to come in and look. And so if your house didn't sell last year, then they really have no good idea of what the fair market value is. They're going to do it based on looking at other sales in the neighborhood, and other houses in the neighborhood, that sort of thing. And they're just going to make their best guess at what that house would be worth. So the assessed value is a percentage of that full fair market value. So in this case, and for most purposes, it's going to be 40% of the assessed value. That's going to be true for all of Fulton County. There are at least one city that has a different assessed value percentage, but 40% is generally going to be it. So in this example, the home's worth $100,000. They're being taxed at $40,000. Now, the great thing about homestead exemptions is you subtract those from that taxable value. So our example is that it's a $50,000 senior exemption. They're not going to give you money back. So the total, when you subtract that, it's going to be zero. But if that amount was less, and so there was something left, then that amount gets multiplied by the millage rate, and that determines how much your taxes are. So this is going to appear on pretty much every line of your tax bill. Different lines will get different amounts subtracted based on the exemptions, because not all exemptions apply to all of the lines. So you want to be aware that there's going to be variations, but this is essentially the calculation that's going to happen on every one of those lines. So again, there are three pieces that make up your tax bill, and those turn out to be three pieces that you have at least some ability to control. The first is the value. The second is the exemptions, the homestead exemptions, because the lower the value is, the lower your taxable rate is. The higher the exemptions are, the more it gets subtracted from the taxable rate, and so you end up paying less for taxes. The third one is the millage rate, and basically, the lower the millage rates are, the lower your taxes are going to be. So the three places that you have some control over what your property tax bill ends up looking like is applying for all the homestead exemptions that you are eligible to get, appealing your property tax value, because if you appeal the fair market value that they have and get it lower, then that lowers your taxable value, which lowers your taxes. And then the third thing is the millage rate. Now that's going to be more of a political process, so I'm not going to get into that tonight. But basically, that's when the city, the county, and the schools have public hearings to determine what that millage rate should be in order to meet their budgets. Okay, so let's start with the homestead exemption. And Charlotte Trumbull at Grandmama's house always describes the homestead exemption as her big fat discount coupon, which is just a great way of explaining it, because it really is. It's basically some amount that you are subtracting from that taxable value. So it's automatically going to save you money. The video already talked about this, that there's a basic exemption that you can get regardless of your age or income. There's some additional ones that you can get as you age or as other life events happen. One thing to mention on those is that on a lot of them, especially the senior ones, there are some income limits, but not all income is counted. So don't be put off by the income limit that's there. If your income is primarily from Social Security, you're probably going to qualify, because most Social Security isn't going to count. Some retirement may not count. So it's worth exploring whether you're eligible for these as you age, just in case. Now, you do have to apply for these additional exemptions. So if you're getting the basic exemption and then you turn 62, you need to go down and apply for the 62 and older exemptions. Also, with the ages, you're going to need to be that age as of January 1st. So if you turn 65 on January 2nd, you're going to need to wait until the following year to get that exemption. Okay, so floating exemption. So this is one of those things that we talk about every year, and we always get a little bit bogged down in it. And I keep trying to find different ways of explaining it. So I'm going to try a couple of different ways with y'all and see if maybe this works. So let's say you're a homeowner, you're in your little homeownership, and it's basically coasting along on the big waves that are the property values. They go up, they may come down, but for the most part in the city of Atlanta and just the metro Atlanta area, most of them are just up and up and up. And so again, the higher the fair market value is, the higher your taxable value ends up being, the assessed value. And so the way a floating exemption works is that it takes the taxable value and caps it at a lower place. So in this case, it's basically floating along on the light blue waves instead of the dark blue waves. And so it's only going up as much as the rate of inflation. In the city of Atlanta and Fulton County, it's based on the consumer price index, but it's capped at 3% per year. So if your value spikes, the taxable value is only going to go up no more than 3%. And so that makes it a little more predictable from year to year about what your taxes will be, because what they do is to the difference between the amount of the value increase in the fair market value and that capped value, that gets added into your exemptions to, again, reduce how much you end up having to be taxed on. So how does that work? So here's an example of how you can really see the benefit of a floating exemption. This is actually a pretty dated example. This is a tax bill from 2018. And so some of you may remember that 2018 is when the Fulton County suddenly increased the values tremendously, like countywide. And so people were surprised. And what it did is it resulted in these higher tax bills. But the other thing that happened that year is that the city of Atlanta passed the floating exemption. And so the same person, her 2019 tax bill was cut almost in half. And that was almost entirely based on the fact that she got the floating exemption and that the value that they've had initially was actually a 2017 value base year. So it was significantly lower than that 2018 taxable value. So people who get a homestead exemption now and have an exemption, they're not going to see that big of a increase, a savings in just 1 year typically, but they will see a huge increase over time as that cap continues to keep the taxable value down instead of having those big jumps. And now we'll try the mathematical way of explaining it. So because the thing that I always struggle with is that I think of this as a value cap, but the way you see it in your tax bill in Fulton County is not showing that. And so, it helps me anyways to understand how those things are really the same. So the example is that the house is worth $250,000. So that means that it's going to be taxed. The assessed value is going to be 40% of that, which is $100,000. But let's say last year the assessed value was only $50,000. That assessed value can only go up no more than 3%. Again, that's based on the consumer price index. So a lot of times it's less than 3%. But just for our example, we're going to go with that cap of 3%. Okay. So the value is 250,000. The 40% assessed value is 100,000. Let's say the base year from last year was 50,000. That can only increase no more than the CPI, the consumer price index amount, or 3%, whichever is lower. So we're going to just sort of use that higher limit. And so that would be 1,500. So you add that to the 50,000, and that's going to be the cap for the assessed value for this year. And so in the example that's here, you can see under the value cap line, that assessed value is 51,500. But the way your tax bill looks is it'll actually show the assessed value as that full 40% assessed value. And then they're going to take that difference, that 48,500, and they're going to add it to the exemption. And so what ends up happening is that you're still getting the benefit of that sort of cap on how much your assessed value can go up, and then adding to it the additional exemptions that you get. So in this example, it's the basic exemption of 30,000. And so that gets subtracted from the assessed value to give you the net assessment, and then that gets multiplied times the millage rate to give you what the tax amount is. So you can see that it ends up being the same no matter which way you calculate it. And so that instead of being taxed at that, 100,000, being taxed at only 51,500 makes a huge difference in your tax bill. And a good way to see that is if you think about how it looks if you don't have that that floating exemption. So the City of Atlanta schools do not have the floating exemption. And many of you may remember we actually voted on a statewide floating exemption last November. It gave the different jurisdictions the authority to opt out of that. And so the Atlanta schools were one of the jurisdictions that opted out. So they still do not have this floating exemption. But so this orange line is basically what the tax bill would look like for the same house if they had the senior exemption. So the highest exemptions that you can get as a senior on the Atlanta schools is 75,000. And so you take the full assessed value, not that capped amount, subtract out the exemptions, which in this case is 75,000, and that gives you a net assessment. And you can see that already that's more than what you would have gotten with the floating exemption, with a basic exemption. So that floating exemption makes a difference. And then you multiply that times the millage rate, and the school tax millage rate tends to be fairly high. And so that can end up making a big difference in people's taxes. And this is where I get a lot of calls from seniors saying, wait, I'm a senior, I shouldn't be paying these school taxes. Unfortunately, it depends on the jurisdiction, and the City of Atlanta doesn't have a full exemption for seniors. So that's the beauty of the floating exemption.
I had read that Fulton County had opted out of the homestead exemption for this particular year, or for the next year, I guess what would be 2026. Do you have any information regarding that? Because I feel like I might have gotten some misleading information, but it was in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, so I do think that's right. I have to admit, I did not double check that. I had heard that as well. But I think that they did opt out of the new statewide exemption, but they already had their own floating exemption. So you'll still have that. You just won't have the statewide one. For jurisdictions where you have both an existing floating exemption and of the new statewide one, the assessor's office is going to evaluate which one is better for the taxpayer and apply that one.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why, again, the floating exemption is something that is going to be beneficial. It may not be it depends on which floating exemption your jurisdiction has.
And when you say jurisdiction, you mean county?
Well, so there's 3 taxing jurisdictions. There's the city, the county, and the schools. So if you're in an unincorporated area that doesn't have a city, then you're not going to have that one. But everyone is going to have the county and the schools.
And if you're in the City of Atlanta, you'll have that as well.
Yeah, if you're in the City of Atlanta, you'll have the City of Atlanta schools. But again, the City of Atlanta schools do not have a floating exemption. They do have exemptions. It's just not the floating exemption.
Thank you.
Thanks for the questions.
Just so that I'm comprehending and understanding what you're saying, you're stating that the City of Atlanta residents voted against the floating exemption? That would
No,
they voted for it.
I don't know exactly how the City of Atlanta voted. The residents of City of Atlanta, I don't know exactly how they voted on it. The referendum passed statewide, and I think it passed in most jurisdictions individually, but I didn't look at that data. But that law allowed for the individual jurisdictions to go through their own political process to be able to opt out. And so they actually held 3 public hearings on whether or not to opt out, and then voted to opt out of it. Oh, there we go. Okay. So who is eligible? This is where I get really passionate, and the video talked about it a little bit, but this is, I'm gonna dig in because this is just where I really want y'all to spread the word. So the terms we usually use and who's eligible for homestead exemption is if you own your home and live in it. So it needs to be your primary residence. And you have to have some ownership interest, but doesn't necessarily have to be a deed in your name. But if you have a deed in your name, that's easy. You definitely qualify. All you have to do is apply. You're going to get the homestead exemption, at least the basic, and any others that you apply for and qualify for. But state law actually allows for some additional people to be able to get the exemption, even if they don't technically have a deed in their names. So to have this sort of bona fide claim to ownership that qualifies for homestead exemptions, it does have to be your primary residence. And if you have a deed in your name, then again, that's the easy one. Now, it's also true that you can get the exemption if the deed is in your name and other people's names, even if those other people don't live there and get exemption somewhere else. Now, there's an exception for spouses, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But as long as the owner who lives in the home is applying for the homestead exemption, they should be able to get it. You do want to apply, if you have joint owners and multiple people live in the home, you want to have the one who's entitled to the highest exemptions make the application, because they're going to get the highest exemptions. They're not going to give you, they're not going to add the different owners' exemptions together. But again, even if your co-owner has their own home and gets an exemption on their own home, as long as you're not married to them, you're still going to be eligible to get exemptions in your home. A person with a life estate also gets is entitled to exemptions. And that's, even though they don't have the full deed in their name, they still have that life estate. That's enough to be able to qualify. A person with a contract for purchase of the home, where the end result of that contract is going to be that they actually qualify for the homestead exemption, they're going to be eligible for the homestead exemption. A person who resides in a home that's owned by a parent who is deceased or incapacitated is entitled to the exemptions, regardless of whether the estate or the property has been distributed. If the property had been distributed, then that's where they would have a deed in their name. The deed putting it into somebody's name means that they've distributed the property. And so to me, where it says, regardless of whether it's been distributed, that is saying that you should be able to get the exemption even if you haven't actually got that deed in your name yet. Similarly, if a person who resides in the home that they are going to inherit, they should be able to get the exemption while that home is being probated. So if it's vested in the estate, in the administrator or the executor, then they should still be able to get the homestead exemptions. And again, if it's vested in the administrator or the executor, then clearly there's not a deed in the person's name, because then it would no longer be vested in the administrator or the executor. So as long as that person is the heir or beneficiary living in the home, they should still be able to get the exemption while they're going through that probate process. Now, these two especially are so important when you start talking about heirs property, because sometimes it can take a very long time to go through that probate process. And so it's really key to be able to get the exemptions to keep the homes affordable while you're going through it. And these are the two main ones for that. A person who resides in a home that's in a trust and they're the beneficiary under the trust, they should be able to get the exemptions. And finally, the spouse of a homeowner who lives in the home can get the exemptions, even if the property is in the name of the other spouse. But again, this is where I was saying that there's an exception for spouses. The spouses can only get one exemption. So even if the spouses are separated, live in the homes that they separately own, they're only going to be entitled to one exemption in the state of Georgia. So they'll have to decide which one of them is going to be getting the exemptions. So now when it comes to applying for the homestead exemptions, you may need to show documents showing your ownership. If you have a deed in your name, that's an easy one to find. It's also something that unless you purchase the home late in the year, the tax office may already have that in their records. But if you're applying for the exemptions based on one of these categories where it's not necessarily a deed in your name, then you want to be sure to to come up with the documentation to show that you are eligible based on these criteria by showing how you link to that recorded deed, the last recorded deed. So for example, if you're in the home that you're inheriting from your mom who passed away, you want to show the birth certificate showing that you're the daughter of the mom, the death certificate showing that mom died, any probate records if it's been probated, if there's a will. So you want to basically think through like what documents show that I am eligible based on these criteria. You do have to live in the home. Again, it's got to be your primary residence. There are some exceptions to that. But for the most part, it's going to be that this is your primary residence. This is where you're registered to vote. This is where your car is registered. This is where you primarily live. You can't get exemptions on, a place that you're renting, an investment property, commercial property. None of those are going to be eligible for homestead exemptions. The absolute deadline for applying for the homestead exemption is going to be April 1st. If you apply on April 2nd, you are applying for next year. That's fine, but if you want to get it this year, you definitely need to get that application in. And as the video mentioned, you do apply, and so you need to be sure that you apply. There is some exceptions to that deadline, but for the most part, it requires notifying the tax office that there's a delay. And so it's just going to be easier to go ahead and get that application in for the most part. Be sure to check with your city. The city of Atlanta does use Fulton County to process their applications for homestead exemptions, but some of the other cities don't, especially for a senior exemption or something like that. Just check with your city to make sure that there's, if there's a separate application you need to do there so that you're not, leaving that on the table. When you apply for the homestead exemption, you want to be sure that you get proof that you did file it by the deadline, because if you miss that deadline, again, you're going to be applying for next year. So if you're applying online, then you want to be sure that you see the screen that says the confirmation that you have submitted the application. And it should also send you an email. So you want to be sure that you have that proof that you actually did file it. If you apply in person, they should give you a receipt. And so you want to be sure to hold on to that receipt to show that you actually did apply by the deadline. If you are applying by mail, so you can actually go online and get the paper form for applying for the homestead exemption. If you're going to submit that by mail, you want to be sure that you mail it in a way that you're going to get proof that, send it certified mail showing the date that it was, put into the mail, and then also that it was received. It has to be, if you're doing it by mail, it has to be postmarked on or before April 1st. So it doesn't actually have to be received by April 1st in the mail, but it does have to be postmarked. And sometimes if you take the mail to the post office on a certain day, it may not get postmarked that day. And so that's why you want to be sure that you mail it in a way that shows that you actually did submit it that day. And if you get denied, file an appeal. And that's true even if you applied and then you get your notice of assessment and it's not showing the exemption you applied for. The notice of assessment is going to be the primary time to be able to appeal. So you want to go ahead and appeal. And then, a lot of times it's just that Fulton County is still working on processing those appeals. And so at the, it may be that you file your appeal and then you get a notice saying that the homestead exemption has been approved. You can just withdraw your appeal. It's no big deal. So, but if you don't appeal and it turns out that they've somehow mislaid your application, this is really your main opportunity to be able to put in that appeal. So it's better to go ahead and get it in just in case. There are a couple of deferral options where somebody can actually ask that the taxes be deferred so that rather than paying the taxes, they just sort of get added to the, they just sort of are liens that are sitting there being owed on the property. They accrue interest, but not as at a higher rate, and they're not going to be foreclosed on. but the limits for these deferral options are very strict. So when they say the income has to be 15,000 or less, they mean that. So, they're very strict, and there's some limits on how much equity you can have in the home. So it's harder to get these. You do have to apply for these by April 1st as well. And then, and you have to apply for it every year. So if you get the deferral in 1 year, you want to keep applying for it to make sure that those taxes still keep being deferred.
I have a question. Do you have to file an exemption each year?
That's actually a very good question. As the video said, you only have to apply once, except there is one low income Fulton exemption that actually expires every 2 years. So you do have to go back and apply every 2 years for that one. All the rest of them should continue as long as you remain eligible. Now, you do have to go back and apply for any of the additional exemptions, like as you age. So, for example, if you have the 62 and older exemption, they're not going to realize, 2 years or 3 years from then that you should be getting the 65 and older one. You have to go back and actually apply for that and remind them that you are now 65 and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to touch on a few more things that are a little bit farther down the road from the homestead exemption, but I just want to sort of put it all into context. A tax appeal is mostly a chance for you to argue for a lower total value that will then lower the taxable value. It's also your chance to show you're eligible for homestead exemptions. So if you've been denied, or again, if it's not showing up as an exemption on your notice of assessment, then you want to go ahead and appeal that as well. You want to appeal within 45 days of the notice of assessment of the date that is made available, not the date you receive it. So, as soon as they make it available, that timeline starts ticking. That date changes every year. So, with the homestead exemption, that deadline is going to be April 1st. You don't know exactly when that notice of assessment is going to come out. So we don't know exactly when the appeal deadline is going to be. But usually the notice of assessment comes out in the May-June timeframe. So, be on the lookout for that and listen for any news reports about it. If you appeal your property taxes and you see that appeal through to the end, so you do the Board of Equalization hearing or get an agreement with the assessor's office for a value. If that value is lower than the notice of assessment value, then you will get a 3-year freeze. So that means that whatever that lower value is for the appealed year will continue for the following 2 years. So you'll get that value for 3 years. Going through to a Board of Equalization hearing sounds scary, but it's not. The Board of Equalization is just 3 taxpayers that have been chosen to hear these cases. They're taxpayers just like you. They have a lot of the same concerns that you have. They've been, they've got a little bit of training on this issue, but mostly they're there just to listen to you and to the appraiser about what the value should be, and then they are tasked with trying to figure out what they think the value should be. If you can present evidence that supports a lower value, a lot of times you can get the Board of Equalization to go with a value that's lower than what the assessed value said. You do have to present evidence, though. If your argument is just that I can't afford the taxes, there's really nothing the Board of Equalization can do, no matter how sympathetic they are. So you want to be able to show that there's some reason why the value should be lower. The condition of the house is not as good as what the assessors think it is, or that the homes in your neighborhood are valued lower, and so you should be lower too, or that the sales in the neighborhood support a lower value. So you want to give some sort of evidence to show it. And that all sounds very abstract. So I find this graphic is really helpful because it sort of gives you a visual of what I'm talking about. Basically, what you want to do is present evidence that your home is really the modest home that you know it to be, instead of, the grand palace that the tax assessors seem to think it is when they start putting the value on it.
If
your taxes do go up and you end up getting the value freeze, is there money coming back to you, or is the value freeze in lieu of any money that you get back? Thank you.
Okay, so the freeze is the whatever value you end up getting for the year that's under appeal is going to be used as the value for the following 2 years. Hopefully, they will have actually gotten that final value before the second and third years come out. And so that'll automatically be applied for those second and third years. The harder answer is with that year that's under appeal. And that's the piece that I'm going to talk about on this slide. So I'm going to actually just go ahead and run through this slide, and then we can go back to get some questions if there are other questions about the appeal process. So the January 1st is the sort of starting point for everything for a tax year. So to be eligible for the homestead exemption, you have to already have that home ownership interest. You have to already be that age, whatever the criteria is for the homestead exemption, that has to be in place before January 1st. If you turn 65 on January 2nd, you're not going to get the homestead exemption for 65 and older until the following year. April 1st, again, is the deadline for applying for the homestead exemptions. Some point after that, the county will issue the notice of assessment. Usually it's the May-June timeframe. We always try and predict when that's going to be when we're trying to set up a schedule for the next piece of this. But the last few years it's been in June. They keep trying to make it earlier, but I'm not sure. I have no idea if they'll succeed this year. But whatever date it comes out, you have 45 days to appeal. A key piece of this is if you look at this timeline, your tax bill comes out after the deadline. So by the time you get the tax bill, it is too late to appeal. So you really need to take that notice of assessment very seriously, even though it says this is not a bill. If you do appeal, then when they come out with the tax bills, what they're going to do is they're going to issue a temporary tax bill to that person who was appealed. That temporary tax bill is going to be based on the notice of assessed value. I'm sorry, the 85% of the notice of assessed value or last year's value, whichever is lower. So if last year's value, was lower than whatever is being appealed, odds are good they're going to go with the last year's value. If it was higher than 85% of the new notice of assessed value, then they'll go with that 85% of the notice of assessed value. But whatever that is, you do need to pay that bill. That bill is going to be due. If you don't pay it, there's going to be interest, penalties, and the possibility of a tax foreclosure. So you want to go ahead and pay those. If at the end of this whole process, you end up with a value that's lower than what in that temporary tax bill, they will refund the difference. You will get back the money for you overpaid basically for the taxes. If it turns out that the resulting value is higher than what was in that temporary tax bill, they'll send you a new notice, a new final bill that gives that difference, and you have 30 days to pay that. So
We do have a question from Veronica.
yes.
Hi, so I purchased my home last March. And I was told I couldn't apply for the homestead exemption until this year. But so I guess what I'm asking is, am I grandfathered into last year's exemption? Because I'm not asking this question well, but
No, I think I understand what
I'm gonna get a tax bill this year, obviously. And so I'm just wondering, do I start fresh with my own exemption, even though the property already had a valuation last year, but I wasn't eligible because I didn't own my home in January of last year?
Yeah, so the value and the exemptions are two different things. And you need to be concerned about both of them. The homestead exemptions that the prior owner had continued last year because you didn't buy, they still owned it as of January 1st. So their exemptions
Uh-oh.
continued for last year. Did I
Wait a
freeze
second,
again?
Stacey. Say that sentence one more time. You got a little bit you had to
Mhm.
catch up. Turned into a robot.
Maybe I am a robot. Who knows? But okay. So I've lost my train of thought. The exemptions that were in place when you bought the home will continue as long as that person had the exemption, owned the home as of January 1st. The following January 1st, that's when you're going to need to get your exemptions. So you purchased in March, you really need to apply before April 1st of this year to get your own exemptions. And the value that they're going to put on it, assuming this was a, arm's length transaction, then the value that they should put on the property should be that sale value, that, that's going to be the fair market value for the house. So it should be that. And that is going to now be your base year. So for any of the floating exemptions, that's going to be the value that is the amount that it goes up each year is going to be capped with that value. So the value that's in your tax bill this year should be no more than 3% higher than whatever that value was.
Got it. And may I ask one more follow-up question to that?
Uh-huh.
Since this will be the first year that I'm applying for the exemption, I can go ahead and apply for floating exemption and all of these other options in one go? Or do I have to apply for the homestead exemption and then apply separately for this floating? And I know you've said something about this before, so forgive me if I'm not understanding.
No, and it's really good for us to clarify that because I do think that gets a little confusing. When you apply for the homestead exemptions, what you're going to do is you're going to apply generally for the homestead exemptions. If you're asking, if you're really eligible for the basic exemption, then you'll just go through the application and say, that you don't want the senior exemptions and all that stuff because you don't qualify for them. If you're applying for like the senior exemptions, then it's going to ask, do you want to apply for the ones, but it's the way it's phrased is actually kind of backwards. What it's really trying to get at is, are you trying to apply for the low income exemptions as well? And that it's, are you trying to apply just for the senior exemption with no income limits? And the answer to that, if you're applying for the low income ones, is no, because then it'll give you the questions to ask about the income and all of that stuff to get into what other exemptions you might be eligible for. And so that one application is going to be processed for all of the different exemptions, and the assessor's office is going to be tasked with trying to make sure that you're getting the highest exemptions you're eligible for based on the information in that application. So, if you're just applying for the first time at 70 and you qualify for the 70 or older exemptions, it should give you the basic exemption, floating exemption, and the 70 and older exemptions all in that one application. If, however, you've applied in the past and gotten the basic exemption, but now you may be eligible for a higher one, you want to submit a new application. And again, the assessor's office will go through and figure out which is the best exemptions that you're eligible to get. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
And the one caveat on that is that if there's city exemptions, you may need to do a separate application with the city. So the recap for homestead exemptions is this gets subtracted from the taxable value. They need to apply and reapply as things change. The deadline is April 1st to get it for this year. So get your applications in. You should appeal if you're denied. Don't let them just say no. And because if you're eligible, you need to fight for it. For tax appeals, argue to reduce the value, to be able to reduce the taxable value, present evidence of what the value should be, and the BOE is not scary. And then you get the freeze if they get a lower value, even if that value is only lowered by $1. and then the information is here.
So can I not apply for the homestead exemption when I file my taxes, or do I have to file the homestead exemption separately? And again, I'm sorry if you already answered this, but I'm just a little confused about that. So can I apply for the homestead exemption when I file my taxes, or do I have to file my taxes and apply for the homestead exemption separately?
Yeah, so when you say file your taxes, I assume you're talking about the income taxes, and those are completely
Yeah.
separate from your property tax. So
Gotcha.
your income tax is going to be filed with the Department of Revenue and the IRS. Your property tax, homestead exemption, or all the property tax stuff is going to come from a county, and so it's going to be you would apply to the county for that homestead exemption. And so yes, it's going to have to be separate.
Yeah, my question, I just want to clarify. So if an individual is actually currently under contract to purchase a home, but they are going to close after the deadline, can they still apply and receive the exemption?
So this is where it's not 100% clear. I think that they should be able to. I think this the end result of that contract was to be able to own the home. And so as long as the contract was entered before January 1st, they should still be able to get the exemption. We've mostly used this in what we call a contract for deed case, where someone basically enters a contract that says, you pay me for the next 30 years, and then I will give you the deed to the home. So in those, we've made the argument that should clearly be a situation where they should get the exemption, because the end result at the end of the 30 years, they really do own the home. With a regular home closing, usually there's going to be a closing that, is sort of separate from the contract. It's just called for in the contract, but I think it's still worth trying.
If an individual, say for instance, you have a borrower who got their parent or grandparent who is at the age to receive the senior citizen exemption, and they're both on the deed, would that senior citizen exemption apply for that home?
Yeah, if the senior is one of the owners living in the home, then what you would do is have that senior be the applicant for the homestead exemption, because you want to have the person who's eligible for the highest exemptions get the exemptions. Now, the hard part is going to be when that senior dies, then a joint owner should also be able to get exemptions, but they may not be eligible for that senior exemption. So they want to be, act quickly to go ahead and get the exemptions in their name, so that there's no question of getting that senior exemption removed. And right now, the county actually removes it retroactively a lot of times. So they'll charge a person, the higher taxes for this year and for the 3 years prior, and you can't go back in time and apply. So you want to be sure to act pretty quickly on making sure that you're getting those exemptions. And joint owners should still be eligible for that, base year, because they shared at that point. But it's important to try and get those highest exemptions, but just be careful that you don't end up, running into a problem when the person passes away.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to when you were talking about appealing the valuation of the house, the types of evidence that you can kind of get. So like if you did a third party assessment for something like PMI removal, would that be something that, would that be submissible, or what kinds of, how does that work?
We will actually be doing a whole new session on like tax appeals and things like that, probably around the time that the notice of assessment comes out. So we'll get into all of that detail. But really, it's basically whatever evidence you can find that supports a lower value. There's no right or wrong answer. If you have, a third party evaluation of the value, that's going to be, some evidence to show that the value should be whatever they said. A lot of people don't have that. And so there are other things they can find that, again, we'll get into a lot more of those details at a future session.
Awesome. Look forward to it.
I did the appeal last year and went through the board, and I was in agreement with with the value. I did it because I wanted to get the freeze for 3 years. So, so will that be, so that's where I was a little perplexed about the freeze part.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that changed this year. So last year you got the freeze automatically. So even if you didn't get the reduction in value,
Mm-hmm.
you got the freeze. So the fact that you appealed last year, you do get that freeze automatically for the 3 years, assuming that you saw it through to the end.
Okay,
This
so
year, if you appealed this year,
mhm.
you have to get a lower value to get that freeze.
Okay, so last year I was in agreement with the value. So does that mean it automatically freezed? We don't
But
know.
well, you said that you were in agreement with the value, but you did see it through to the Board of Equalization,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
I had the appointment. Yes. Yes.
And you went to it?
It was a virtual appointment.
Okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
so as long as you attended that hearing
Mhm.
and whatever that resulting value is, that's
Mhm.
going to be it for last year and the next 2 years. So this year and next year.
Okay. Okay.
So, but again, unfortunately, going forward, in order to get that freeze, it's going to have to be some sort of reduction in the value. It can't be the same value as what's in the notice of assessment.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope you guys found this informative. Please give me your true thoughts so that we can do everything you need, have more snacks. And thank you for joining us online. Thank you again, Stacy, for joining us. And I will see you guys at the next workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.